What if the story we have been telling about Neanderthals has been built on a misunderstanding so deep that it has blinded us to what is sitting plainly in front of us, preserved in stone, smeared across tools, and embedded in the quiet layers of caves like Moustier and La Quina, where something does not quite fit the neat narrative of slow decline and inevitable replacement, but instead hints at a population that was experimenting, adapting, and then quite suddenly disappearing. For most of the 20th century, Neanderthals were framed as a kind of evolutionary dead end, a robust but ultimately limited branch of humanity that could use fire but perhaps did not truly understand it, that could shape stone but not transform materials, that could survive but not innovate. Yet when archaeologists returned to old collections and re-examined forgotten artifacts from Le Moustier, a different picture began to emerge, one that did not rely on grand speculation but on microscopic traces, chemical residues, and patterns of wear that had been overlooked for decades. These were not dramatic discoveries pulled from untouched caves, but objects that had been sitting in museum drawers since the early 20th century, quietly waiting for someone to ask the right question. At Le Moustier, the evidence did not announce itself immediately. It appeared instead as faint residues on stone tools, a combination of ochre and bitumen that at first glance seemed unremarkable, perhaps even incidental. But under closer inspection, the pattern became difficult to ignore. The tools did not simply carry traces of adhesive used to attach them to wooden handles, as had been assumed in earlier interpretations. Instead, the adhesive itself formed a kind of grip, a deliberately engineered surface that allowed the user to hold the tool without slipping, without sticking, and without losing control. This was not a crude solution, but a refined one, the result of repeated experimentation with proportions that should not, in theory, have worked. The mixture itself raises immediate questions. Bitumen, in its natural form, is already adhesive, already capable of binding materials together. But when mixed with large amounts of ochre, something changes. The adhesive properties begin to degrade, and yet, at Le Moustier, the mixture contains more than 50% ochre, a ratio that seems counterintuitive unless the goal was not simply to stick objects together, but to create a material with specific tactile properties. Experimental reconstructions suggest that the optimal ratio hovered around 55% ochre and 45% bitumen, a balance that reduced stickiness while maintaining cohesion, producing a dry, workable grip that would not adhere to the hand. This is not accidental behavior. It implies an understanding of material properties, a willingness to test variations, and a memory of outcomes that could be applied across multiple tool-making episodes. Once this realization takes hold, it becomes difficult to maintain the older image of Neanderthals as passive users of their environment. They were not merely selecting materials, they were transforming them. They were combining substances to produce new properties, effectively creating one of the earliest synthetic composites known in the archaeological record. The presence of wear patterns reinforces this interpretation. Microscopic analysis reveals two distinct types of polish on the tools, one along the cutting edges, consistent with contact with worked materials, and another across the grip area, produced by friction between the hand and the ochre-rich adhesive. The tool was not slipping, it was not loosely held, it was integrated into the hand through a designed interface. This raises a deeper question about cognition. To produce such a material, one must not only understand that substances can be combined, but also anticipate the outcome of that combination. There is a temporal dimension to this behavior, a recognition that actions in the present will produce effects that can be evaluated and refined. This is the foundation of experimental thinking. It is also the foundation of chemistry, not in the formalized sense of equations and reactions, but in the practical sense of manipulating matter to achieve desired results. And once this threshold is crossed, it becomes difficult to draw a clear line between Neanderthal behavior and what we would later recognize as technological innovation. The evidence for this kind of thinking does not end with adhesives. At multiple sites across France, including locations associated with Le Moustier, archaeologists have uncovered blocks of manganese dioxide, often shaped, worn, and clearly used. For decades, these were interpreted as pigments, perhaps used for body decoration or symbolic purposes. But this interpretation carried its own problems. If the goal was simply to produce black coloration, charcoal would have been more readily available and easier to apply. The deliberate collection and processing of manganese dioxide suggests a different purpose, one that only becomes clear when its chemical properties are considered. When powdered manganese dioxide is added to wood, it lowers the ignition temperature, making it significantly easier to start a fire. This is not an obvious property, nor is it one that would be discovered without repeated experimentation. It requires observation, comparison, and the ability to isolate variables, even if only intuitively. If Neanderthals were grinding this mineral into powder and applying it to kindling, they were not relying on lightning strikes or naturally occurring fires. They were creating fire on demand, controlling it, and integrating it into their daily lives in a way that suggests both planning and understanding. This transforms the role of fire from a passive resource to an active technology. Fire becomes something that can be initiated, sustained, and manipulated. It becomes a tool in its own right, used not only for warmth and cooking, but also for the production of other materials. The creation of birch bark tar, for example, requires the controlled heating of bark in an oxygen-limited environment, a process known as dry distillation. This is not a trivial task. It demands control over temperature, airflow, and timing, as well as an understanding of the relationship between heat and transformation. The resulting tar is a powerful adhesive, waterproof, durable, and versatile. At sites in Germany such as Königsauer and Indernaltdorf, residues of birch tar have been found on stone tools, confirming that Neanderthals were capable of producing this material tens of thousands of years before similar technologies appear in other contexts. The implications are difficult to ignore. Birch tar is not something that occurs naturally in usable form. It must be made, and to make it, one must create a system in which the bark is heated without burning, capturing the resulting condensate and preserving it for use. This is a multi-step process, one that requires foresight and coordination. The use of pine resin adds another layer to this picture. Resin is both flammable and adhesive, making it useful as a fire starter, a sealant, and a binding agent. It can be applied to tools, used to waterproof seams, or even employed as a medicinal substance due to its antiseptic properties. The integration of resin into tool-making and daily life suggests a broad knowledge of plant resources, an awareness of their properties, and the ability to select and process them for specific purposes. Pine cones, rich in resin and highly flammable, would have served as reliable ignition materials, especially in damp conditions where other kindling might fail. Taken together, these behaviors point to a population that was deeply engaged with its environment, not merely exploiting it, but transforming it. The Neanderthals at Moustier were not just making tools, they were engineering solutions. They were adjusting material properties, optimizing performance, and integrating multiple technologies into coherent systems. Fire, adhesives, and raw materials were not separate domains, but interconnected elements of a broader technological framework. And yet, when we turn to La Quina, the narrative begins to shift in a way that is far more difficult to reconcile. La Quina is not a marginal site. It is one of the classic Mousterian locations, a place that preserves a long sequence of Neanderthal occupation, layer upon layer of activity that speaks to continuity, stability, and repeated use. The tools are abundant, the faunal remains extensive, and the overall impression is one of a well-established camp, a place where people lived, worked, and returned over time. But in the final layers, something changes. The pattern breaks. The orderly accumulation of material gives way to something more chaotic, more fragmented, as if the rhythm of occupation had been disrupted. Bones and stones are scattered in ways that do not suggest gradual abandonment or slow decline. There is no evidence of the site being worn out through overuse, no gradual thinning of activity that might indicate a population under stress. Instead, the sequence simply stops. The dating of this transition is particularly striking. Around 42,000 years ago, within a window of perhaps a few centuries, the occupation at La Quina comes to an end. In archaeological terms, this is not a slow fade. It is an abrupt cessation, compressed into a time frame that suggests rapid change rather than long-term evolution. The layers do not taper off, they terminate. Within this context, the discovery of a young Neanderthal woman adds a deeply human dimension to the story, one that complicates any simple interpretation. She was found in a muddy deposit, not carefully placed, not surrounded by grave goods, and not positioned in a way that suggests intentional burial. The evidence indicates that she may have fallen from a cliff and been carried by water into the location where she was eventually preserved. There's no sign of ritual, no indication that her body was deliberately interred. This is unusual. At other sites, Neanderthals have been associated with burials, with bodies placed in specific positions, sometimes accompanied by artifacts or pigments. The absence of such behavior at La Quina raises questions about what was happening in the final phase of occupation. Was this an anomaly, a single event that does not reflect broader patterns? Or does it hint at a breakdown in social practices, a disruption in the cultural norms that had previously governed behavior? The contrast between Le Moustier and La Quina becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. At one site, we see evidence of experimentation, innovation and control over materials that suggests a population fully engaged in technological development. At the other, we see a sudden rupture, a collapse of continuity that is not easily explained by gradual decline. The two narratives do not align neatly. Instead, they create tension, a sense that something is missing from the conventional explanation. If Neanderthals were capable of producing complex adhesives, controlling fire through chemical means, and manipulating a wide range of materials, then the idea that they simply faded away due to inferiority becomes harder to sustain. The technological evidence does not support a model of stagnation. It suggests adaptability, creativity, and resilience. And yet, the archaeological record shows a rapid disappearance, a pattern that unfolds across multiple sites within a relatively short period. One possibility is that external factors played a decisive role, forces that disrupted Neanderthal populations in ways that left little trace in the material record. Climate fluctuations, changes in ecosystem structure, or the arrival of new populations could all have contributed to this pattern. But even these explanations struggle to account for the speed and synchronicity of the disappearance. The compression of events into a narrow time frame suggests something more immediate, more coordinated, though not necessarily intentional in the sense of direct conflict. Another possibility is that the very innovations we see at sites like Le Moustier represent a final phase of adaptation, a last attempt to respond to changing conditions. The development of improved grips, more reliable fire-starting techniques, and advanced adhesives could reflect a population under pressure, refining its technologies in response to new challenges. If this is the case, then the evidence of chemical ingenuity is not a sign of stable prosperity, but of rapid adjustment, an acceleration of innovation in the face of uncertainty. But even this interpretation leaves unanswered questions. If Neanderthals were capable of such rapid adaptation, why did it not continue? Why does the archaeological record show a termination rather than a transition? Why do the layers at La Quina end so abruptly, without the gradual transformation we might expect if one population were simply evolving into another or being replaced over time? The deeper one looks, the more the narrative resists simplification. The chemistry of fire starting, the engineering of tool grips, and the abrupt disappearance of entire populations do not fit comfortably within a single explanatory framework. They point instead to a complex interplay of factors, some visible, others hidden, all contributing to a story that remains only partially understood. In the end, the sites of Le Moustier and La Quina do not provide a conclusion so much as a challenge. They force us to reconsider what we think we know about Neanderthals, to question assumptions that have been repeated for decades, and to confront the possibility that the disappearance of our closest relatives was not a slow, inevitable process, but a sudden and unresolved event. The tools remain, the residues still cling to their surfaces, and the layers of sediment preserve a record that is at once detailed and incomplete, leaving us with the unsettling sense that we are looking at the aftermath of something we do not yet fully understand. And with that statement, we leave you to ponder the mysteries of our shared human history. Until next time, stay curious and stay questioning. Also, please subscribe, share and explore our channel's other videos. Thank you, and take care.